Well, thank you for having me tonight. I'm really, really appreciative of this. And I'll tell you, from everything I've learned, this is the best kept secret in amateur radio, this RATPAC. And looking through the program list and stuff you guys offer, what a great educational opportunity for people. So well done. I am Bill, AJ8B, and one of the things we're going to cover, well, here's a list of things we're going to talk about. Who I am a little bit. Basically, this is it's a talk about a DX podcast, but more than anything, you can take away from the bolts of putting a podcast together, which is cool, which will be fine. But then we will talk a little bit DX. We'll talk about podcast, how popular they are. Why do I call it the DX Mentor, and how did that come around? And then some of the nuts and bolts and the results. It's a 30 to 40 minutes. So if you can stay awake with me that long, it'd be great. So who I am, that's my shack and the radio in the car. I was first licensed in 71. However, I didn't really start chasing DX until 1980. So I've been chasing DX for a couple of solar cycles now. I've got 323 mixed, not too far from honor roll, but at the pace I'm going, I'll get there eventually. But try to stay as active as I can every night and every week, and it keeps me healthy, I guess. Some of the things I was a CW Ops instructor for 6 sessions. I'm the president of the Southwest Ohio DX Association. I edit their newsletter. I also edit the Twin City DX newsletter out of St. Paul. I'm the end sorter for the 8th Area QSL Bureau. I have the DX Mentor podcast, and I'm a weekly contributor to the This Week in Amateur Radio podcast. So, a lot to keep me busy, which is a good thing because my wife likes to read. So, in the evenings, she goes one way and I go the other, and it's been working out fine for over 40 years. So, if you need to contact me, the easiest way is aj8b at arl.net. And these are some of the QSL cards that I've had in the last 5 or 6 years from Caesars Creek, which is right here in Waynesville. Um, and if you are likely to chase DX, here's some of the dangers you can run into. Some of you may recognize that character from the 60s and 70s, always warning us of DX. You may get the DX bug and go overboard. I think this is Anthony's shack from a few years ago. And this is a car that was once, I've never seen it, but I understand it was at Hamvention one year. I don't know if they drove it or towed it, but um, we kind of had a discussion one night at how many miles of coax are probably in that car, if those were all hooked up. So it'd be kind of interesting. Um, this cartoon is kind of close to me because when I was in junior high, I'd ride around with my dad, and he was a ham, KDWE, and he would point to a sign or say it, and then I would have to spell it to him in Morse code. So I, I kind of look at this guy, and it kind of rings a bell for me. Um, I don't know how many of you have done this where you're involved in contesting or DXing, or you're just, spending a lot of time on the radio, and you come in and you're exhausted. And my wife will say this, "Boy, I'm so glad you have a hobby you can enjoy, and you're ready to collapse." But balance is important. This young lady is one of my favorite cartoons I came across. Me or chasing DX, and he said 73s, which kind of reminds me of there's a country song about it's either me or go fishing, and he says, boy, am I gonna miss her. So it's the same kind of thing. And a lot of us do chase DX on the contest weekends because Anthony and I were just talking a minute ago. It's kind of a target rich environment. It's an easier time to get some DX you may not normally work or may not normally be on. So contest weekends are good for that. And I think anybody who's tuned in tonight will hear this question and maybe would come up with the same answer I did. My favorite band might be 30 meters or 17. And that's not what she had in mind, but certainly what I was thinking. But in any case, if you're going to work the X or spend any time at all persistent in ham radio, I think you need an attitude. And I love this guy in the commercials. I really like those commercials when they were on, and I came across these two cartoons. The other one is, but when I do, I prefer that the expeditions call me. That's never happened to me, but that's okay. You still need to have that attitude. Here's the ultimate ham shack. It's just kind of a chair with a monitor and a wireless keyboard. And this is from a friend of mine, W0VTT in St. Paul. Claims he uses it. I don't think Mike really does, but that's okay. It's kind of a cool idea. So what is a podcast? And we can't really do a show of hands, but I know a lot of people have tried to listen to podcasts, but not a lot of people know what they really are. A podcast is a unique digital medium focused on audio storytelling and communication. So it's a way to get your word out or get your message out. They feature dialogue, discussions, and conversations. So it's not really a lecture, if you will, although there are podcasts that are lectures, but it's much more of a discussion and conversation or food for thought, if you will. Podcasts can be accessed via smartphones, tablets, or computers. So any of the three. Now, last year, there was a statistic out that said the percentage of the population per year who had listened to at least one podcast. Well, obviously, the majority of the ones in 2020 would carry through to 24. But in 24, almost 70% of of the US population had listened to at least one podcast. So with all the proliferation of smartphones, it's really not surprising that someone had tried to listen to a podcast. And it's not for everybody, but 70% of the population tried it. Now, there's a variety of popular ham radio podcasts that are out there, and here's a sampling. The QSO Today podcast. We were talking about Eric a minute ago. The Ham Radio Workbench, This Week in Amateur Radio, and Solder Smoke. And I enjoy all of them. The Ham Radio Workbench was the first one I tuned into, and just love those guys. But that's a kind of a wide swath of podcasts that are available, and there's a lot more. So the difference with this graph is how popular are podcasts, and this is the number of people or the percentage of people that have actually subscribed. So in this case, we're looking at, I believe the number was 47.2% of the population is actually subscribed to a podcast. And what that simply means is they click the button, and now anytime there's a new episode of that podcast out, they get notified, or their podcast app reflects the fact that there's a new one. So it's a little more of a commitment than just listening to one of them. But that's pretty serious, 47% of the population. But I also mentioned YouTube earlier, so let's take a look at YouTube. How popular is YouTube? Well, these numbers blew me away. I couldn't believe it. It's the second most popular social media network next to Facebook, which I kind of anticipated that. But this was the most recent stat I could find a little over 2 years ago. More than 500 hours of video were uploaded every minute. That's a staggering amount of video worldwide. And if you ever want to just kill some time and have a great learning experience, go to YouTube and Google, or I'm sorry, search on Google data centers. The videos about their data centers are just unbelievable. They actually save power by removing LEDs from the front panels of their servers because they have so many thousands and thousands and thousands of servers. So when you start thinking about it like that, it's just staggering. YouTube generated 29.2 billion last year in revenue, and there are 2.5 billion monthly active YouTube users worldwide. 2.5 billion. So that's just, to me, it was just crazy stuff. 62% of internet users in the US access YouTube daily. Now, in preparation for this, I've done a survey 3 days in a row. I'm an IT director at a company with about 850 users. And we're closer to about 90% of people hit YouTube sometime during the day. And it's not always around lunchtime, and quite a bit of it is used for work. So, I mean, I wasn't tracking them to see who wasn't doing what they should. I was simply trying to find out how many of our users actually access YouTube during the day. And it was a very high number. So I was curious what age group might be using YouTube. And it didn't drop off as much as I thought it was. 56 and older, it's almost 70%. My wife's parents live with us, and my father-in-law at 90 likes to go out on YouTube, and he has a favorite group called the Texas Tenors, and he likes to go look at their most recent videos and stuff. So it's almost like if you have access to a PC and a keyboard, you're very likely going to be using YouTube. So for anything that I do, I decided we just can't ignore it. So here's some different YouTube channels that I subscribe to, and I've subscribed to many more, but oh, look at that one. So I get notified on the RATPAC. Another one that's really good is the W1DED. He does a tremendous job, very professional. I enjoy his, but those are all really good ones, and they have a lot of good content. And I would suggest any of these you'd be interested in take a look at. So why do both? Because I finally made the decision. I can't ignore YouTube as much as I want to just do a podcast and I want to get the word out. Well, the first reason, once I started thinking about it, was I'm going to use Zoom to record these, and Zoom supports both audio and video, so it's already for both mediums, podcast and YouTube. The video editor I used to use CapCut, and now I use and I'm drawing a blank, but I have a slide here on it in a minute. I can't think of it. But both of the video editors I've used have native support for both video and audio, so that made sense. And statistically, this is interesting. Only 39% of users follow the same topics on both platforms. So you have a very high percentage that's a niche toward podcasts, and you have a very high percentage that lean toward YouTube, and a lower percentage, although not trivial, that follow the same topic on both. So I finally said, you know what, let's just do both. Let's just be done with it. So how did we come up with the DX Mentor? Because another one of my pet projects, if you will, is cybersecurity, and especially around the home, things that people need to know to make sure they stay safe at home. And I thought about doing something on that, but that becomes such a deep dive, and you really need to have expertise. And I decided, well, maybe the DX Mentor was a better way to do it. And I'm always looking for a vehicle to learn. That's why this RATPAC is very exciting to me, because there's so many things to learn in ham radio. Eric Goof, I believe he's the one that kind of describes it as a three-ring circus. And depending on what ring you go into, there's so much going on in there. So it's a vehicle for me to learn. There's a ham in St. Paul. He's a very famous guy. He's the head of the Mayo Clinic up there, K0MD. And Scott is a world traveler and a world DXer. He and I were literally standing in line at a DX convention in Pigeon Forge, and we were talking about the need for a DX book. And I've written a couple of coaching, basketball coaching books for kids, for youth. And we start saying, you know, what we really need is we need a DX book. But the problem with a DX book is it gets old over time. So we thought, well, what if we came up a list of subject matter experts to provide content twice a year? And they would provide it as a PDF, and we would bind it together, you know, updating those sections all the time. And then at any one point, we would have this DX book sitting there where the information in it was no older than 6 months. We thought that would be pretty interesting. And we actually talked to some folks ahead of time and generated some interest. So we contacted the league, and they initially were very interested. Yes, there's a need, and boy, we love that approach. Thumbs up, let's go with it. So I did all the paperwork and did here's a breakout of all the topics and how we're going to do it. We submitted it, and they said, yeah, it was a good idea at the time, but we're really not interested. Okay, so about another year went by, and you know, because you have other things going on, right? You can't just sit around and try to write a book. We went back to them and said, well, we think we're going to change it, or we're going to pull out. No, don't pull out, because we think there's a need for it. Okay, so we got started again. And then not too long after that, there was the ARL released a new DX book. And that's when we decided, you know what, we're going to scrap the whole idea of a book. It's not a good fit for us. So let's pursue something different. And I'd happened to have been a guest on the QSA Today podcast, and I was talking to my mentor about that. And I said, boy, I was on the QSO today. I love this ham radio workbench thing. I wonder if there's something we can do with DX and a podcast. And my mentor, who's Joe, W-A-G-E-X, he lives in Oxford, not too far from here. He always has projects for me, and he basically said, well, how hard can it be? Let's combine DX and podcasts. So I thought, well, maybe. But at the same time, I'd had a conversation with Ray Novak, K9JA of ICOM Radio, and they graciously donate a couple of really nice radios to us every year at Hamvention. He has a personal motivation to get as many young DXers as we can to move up, to get their first 100 countries and then continue to grow after that. And, you know, in talking to him and having this in the back of my mind, the whole idea of a DX mentor just came together. So, you know, we're going to do this. Let's create a podcast. It's a niche podcast. We've got a list of what we consider to be subject experts, matter experts already lined up. Let's start leveraging them. So we decided to do it. So what went from a good idea became a reality in a couple of steps. And to me, the first step was, you know, if I were to send some famous ham who I wanted to get on a podcast an email and says, hi, I'm Bill, AJB, you've never heard from me, but I sure would like 2 hours of your time, chances are they wouldn't do it. So I decided to contact a couple guys I know. The Daily DX, if you're familiar with that, that is a both daily and weekly periodical that comes out via email in a PDF format. DX Engineering, of course, they support anything in the ham radio world that has some good content to it. And then, of course, I already had ICOM. So I approached all three of these guys and said, I'd like to do this. Can I use your name? And they said, sure. And even to this day, almost 3 years later, there's no compensation or anything. They just allow me to use their name. And that helps a ton because when you can say, yes, ICOM knows about me or DX Engineering knows about me, that helps. So here are some of the topics we started out with. And the very first one was what is DX? The second one was the DXCC program. And then we got into things like 6 meters, 60 meters, propagation, CW ops, 6 meter EME. And this is a subset of the topics we've had over 3 years. And then the other thing we wanted to focus on were de-expeditions. And I'll show you in a little bit, but one of the things we try to do is we try to get the de-expedition before it goes to somewhere and then when it comes back. And it's very interesting to find out what their concerns, their fears, and their expectations and their goals are before they leave. And then when they come back, it's fun to kind of say, okay, you said you were going to do this and this and this. How did it turn out? What would you do differently? That's been really, really interesting. And I think they've enjoyed that, and we've certainly enjoyed it a lot. So that's been a big part of the podcast is getting these guys on. The thing about finding guests is I would consider myself a little bit of a shy guy. I'm not the guy in the room that goes around glad handing. I like to just sit back and take it in. And so I wasn't very aggressive at going up and grabbing people and saying, hey, would you be willing to do this? And Joe kept saying, they can't say yes or no until you ask them. And what's the worst that can happen? They say no, and you say, could you recommend somebody? So Joe, WAGEX, has been very good at poking me and moving me on. And the thing about Joe is he's been on almost 70 de-expeditions. He was the co-leader of Swains Island. He was the co-leader of Midway. He's been on some giant successful de-expeditions. So he knows people and he knows what he's talking about. But there's two issues with guests. Of course, the first one is finding them. I said that, and that's not always easy. But the second one, and I was very hesitant to do this, it's coaching them. So here's a group of some of the folks we've had, and if you're somewhat into DX, you may know some of these guys. We've had the one that was really interesting to me was JO3SLK. He does a Japan Castles on the Air. And he was on telling us about how he activates all these castles over there, and a lot of interesting things that we've had on. A lot of interesting folks. But you have to coach them. And again, I was very hesitant. And their lighting and audio is important, and their video is important. And I had one guest who, despite my encouragement, his lights were way too low, his audio was way too loud, and he was too close to the camera. And finally he dropped the look. I do this at work all the time, and this is how it's supposed to be done, and it's not changing. It was like, okay, all right, let's go forward. And once I reviewed the final copy, it was like, oh my gosh, I got to tweak the audio, and you start doing all that by hand, and it becomes hours and hours of work. It turned out okay, but I'll never do that again. It's going to be like, if you're not willing to do it the way we want to do it, we can't do this. And you hate to be that way, but that's only been 1 out of 3 years, so that's really not too bad. So here's some of the software I use. I use a standard Zoom account with just I don't know what it is, $10 or $11 a month or something. That's it, DaVinci Resolve. I couldn't think of it. I use DaVinci Resolve video editing software for videos, and it's free, so there's no outlay there. Zoom again generates both video and audio files, so I like to use it that way. I use Audacity for audio only editing. So on the podcast, I will have commercials, and my wife likes to do them with me. So sometimes we do the husband, wife, spouse kind of a play-off thing. But we do that. I use Audacity and I edit at that. And I store the files locally, and I highlight that because as much as I've had some really high fun times with this, there is a incredibly accomplished 160-meter DXer on the East Coast, K1ZM. And it took us a while for me to get him. We got him. We had a fantastic, absolutely fantastic podcast that went about an hour and 20 minutes. He has literally written the book on 160 that the ARL produces. And we had done 5 podcasts in about a week and a half period, because when people are available, you got to get them. But I launch it every other week. So 5 podcasts turns into 10 weeks. And I was already 3 weeks out. So somewhere around 13 or 14 weeks after we recorded, I go to get it, not realizing that Zoom had a file limitation. They don't keep that stuff forever. And it was gone. It was gone. And I was so embarrassed, and I was really hurt. I was disappointed in myself. I couldn't believe I'd done that. And I had to go back to him and say, and he was very eager about it. I said, here's what happened. And I can't tell you anything other than I screwed up and I apologize. We didn't record it, re-record it, and I hope I'll get him back this year. We'll see. Um, he seemed very gracious, but I don't think it sat too well, and I can't blame him. So now I keep reminding myself, as soon as you're done, go grab it and pull it down. Even if you intend to process it that week, at least you have a copy. So anyway, so here's the hardware. I have a standard Yeti microphone. I have kind of an enhanced webcam that I put up on a stand, so it's right in front of the screen. And I do adjust my lighting as needed, although I see tonight it's a little bit brighter up there than it should be, but I should have spent a little time on that. And this is what it looks like. And y'all have seen probably a Yeti mic and a camera on a stand. I have the camera right in front of the monitor, literally, so that it doesn't look nearly as much like I'm, looking back and forth, trying to read text and stuff. And that's proven to be better. So that kind of works out. So at this point, if you follow with me so far, you've got hardware, software, topics, and guests. Now what? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to create a podcast account somewhere that's going to publish your podcast. And I chose Spotify. There used to be Google Podcasts, and that's gone away. Apple Podcasts is another one, and you can't actually do it in YouTube now. But I have my podcast account. I'm sorry, my Spotify account, and I keep it that way. Maybe you want Apple Podcast or something. Once you create a YouTube account, there is a thing called YouTube Studio, and it's just kind of a pop down. You may have seen it before, but didn't really pay attention to it. For each episode, so to speak, I create intro and exit clips using either Zoom or if it's only audio only, of course, I'll use Audacity. And all that really is I write something up that says, hey, welcome. Here's what we're going to show tonight. Here's how you get back catalog items. Don't forget to look at the show notes when we're done, that kind of thing. And then the exit is, hey, thank you for listening. If you liked it, please subscribe, that kind of stuff. Then I edit the Zoom file. I add commercials to the podcast version. The podcast is much more lenient on you embedding commercials versus YouTube. So I have a commercial for ICOM, DX Engineering, the Daily DX, and the Southwest Ohio DX Association. And they're just audio clips that I put right into it. I don't do that on YouTube because once you get into advertising on YouTube, it's a whole different ballgame. Create a show notes because people love show notes, so they don't have to write stuff down while they're listening. And then you go ahead and upload it to the appropriate source. And I like to put a cover image on it and the show notes. And then you schedule it when you're going to launch it. So I typically try to do it on a Wednesday or a Thursday and have it launch on Saturday. And that gives me a couple days if I think about it, that, boy, I really should have re-recorded a section or edited a section. I'll listen to it. I have an hour commute to work, so I listen to these once or twice. And if I just don't like something, I'll take it out. Again, so 1 week apart. And then I use other platforms to promote it. So whether it's X or it's Facebook, I try to put something out that says, hey, make sure you pay attention to the DX Mentor. We're going to have the RATPAC on this week, and it's really interesting that covers these topics or something. So I try to promote it that way. So what have been some of the results? Like, is it worth doing? What kind of feedback do you get? Well, results, I guess, are in the person looking for them. So in our case, we wanted some way that people could learn about DX, could get better at it, and try to move up the DX ladder. So in 2.5 years, I've answered over 50 emails about DX. Now, people are somewhat shy about sending emails in. So a lot of these have been things like you mentioned that Kate ZT is going on the expedition to Egypt vacation style. What does vacation style mean? Or what is an IRC, an International Reply Coupon? Or what is the QSL Bureau? We get a lot of questions like that. So I take time to answer those. So I didn't have any expectations. So for me, 50 was probably a good number. we get a lot of sharing on Facebook. So a lot of people like things and they will share it with their friends and on their links. So I think that's a good sign. We've added 11 members to the local club, and they usually flag that as I found out about you from the podcast. And Swadex, although headquartered in Southwest Ohio, we're picking up people all over the Midwest now, which is really great. We have over 900 podcast subscribers and just at 1,000 YouTube subscribers. Not quite there yet. Very, very small, modest numbers, but for us in a niche environment, we feel pretty good about it. We've had a couple of episodes that have had over 1,300 listeners or watchers, and what I need to do is figure out how to convert those 1,300 into subscribers and then go from there. But over time. Um, so interesting enough, if you're familiar with Bouvet Island, 3Y0J, there was a lot of controversy about Bouvet. There was a lot of questions about, can they really land on this desolate place in the Antarctic? Are they really spending the money correctly? Why did they pick a sailboat in the Antarctic seas? Why wouldn't they have a different kind? There were a lot of clubs were holding back funds, and a lot of people were holding back funds. So I contacted one of the team leaders, Adrian, and I said, "Hey, I've got a list of 8 or 10 questions from DX clubs in the Midwest that are very concerned about this. Would you be willing to come on?" And he did. And he answered every question I asked. He did not want the questions ahead of time. So I thought that was a good sign. And then when they came back, they spent nearly, I believe it was $800,000, and they worked 19,000 hams. And initially they had kind of said they thought they would work 200 or 225,000, and they worked 19. So there were a lot of people disappointed with that, and a lot of people felt like their money wasn't well spent. So we had Adrian on again and said, "Hey, how do you address some of these issues?" And he was really open about it. And it was very good dialogue. That was number 3 and 4. The number 2 most listened to was an episode on Jarvis Island, N J. And the issue with Jarvis is it's in as far as when you have a DX entity or a country, what makes a country? Jarvis is a gray area because it's far enough away from Baker and Howland and Hawaii to be its own country, but it's also part of that group geographically where it still should remain its own country as part of that other group. So it depends on where you were, whether you thought it should be a new entity or not. So these guys put together a passionate argument for it. The ARLDX Advisory Committee said, "Thanks for your time, but we don't agree at all," and it was not recognized. But we had those folks on, and they kind of pled their case, and it was very interesting. It was very well listened to. It was a lot to learn that night. But the number one overall has been, if you're familiar with FT8, there was a new version that came out with something called SuperFox. Ned Stearns, AA7A, is one of the architects and implementers of SuperFox. He's been a friend of mine for a few years and a really good friend of Joe's, WAGEX, and he just agreed immediately about 3 weeks before they launched it. Ned said, "Yes, I'll be on." And that even today gets watched all the time. That was a terrific episode. And then we did something called Fredonia. And Fredonia was the one that kind of told me that we were probably on the right track. Now, if you follow DXCC, you're wondering, what's Fredonia? I've never heard of that. So, as an April Fool's joke, we decided to have a podcast on a DXpedition that was going to a fictitious country called Fredonia. And I had published this in a couple of different DX newsletters and a couple of DX outlets. And I even picked a little country. So here's a little bit of spur right off of Albania that's out into the Ionian Sea. And we called it Fredonia. And only on April 1st, that day only would it be active. Of course, that being April Fool's Day. I even sent out some very specific pictures of the operating positions, and I gave a list of who was going and when they would be there. And a few people picked up on it and said, "I've heard of Fredonia. I don't know where." And then they did some homework and they said, "Oh, that's from the 1932 movies, The Marx Brothers." And that was basically two countries attacking each other, and one of them was called Fredonia. So Groucho Marx was in this, of course, the Marx Brothers. So that's where I came up with the idea. Literally on a Saturday, one day, watching that in the morning, I thought, "Hey, I wonder if anybody's ever activated Fredonia." And I just tucked that away. So we made up a flag, and I had a podcast, and I had 6 or 7 people on there who were all experienced DXers. They bought into it. Um, Joe, I've mentioned Joe a couple of times, but his wife Janet, WHCAA, she's an expert at fundraising. She was in charge of all the fundraising for Midway, all the fundraising for Swains Island. So Janet knows her way around, knows how to activate, knows how to speak it. So she explained, gave about a 5 minute discussion on how difficult the fundraising was for this Fredonia DXpedition. Everybody carried it off without cracking a smile. It was just terrific. So here's some of the feedback I got, which told me that I've got some listeners that are kind of very interested in what we have to say. Am I the only one here that punched the call into QRZ.com and all of a sudden felt like they've been had? Because the call sign was Groucho, GR0UCH/O. So that was a great piece of email we got. This is one we had on Facebook. Thanks for the new one, guys. I just PayPal'd $80,000 to Janet, which of course he didn't, but the call sign was the confirming clue to the Wikipedia article. Too funny. That was good feedback. This guy said I was on the treadmill and raced to the basement thinking I had about 2 hours to work an all-time new one. I felt so foolish once I sat down and started checking spots. And finally, I called the DX grant manager of our club to ask him to keep an ear out until I could get out of work. Good one. So we knew that, we got some comments back. These guys are actually listening to this. They're taking us seriously. So of all the other stuff, this was the best feedback I had that that we're kind of getting out there. So to look at some actual statistics, though, if I look at the growth of subscribers to this particular podcast, um, you can see the growth. And at the end of 2024 through Q4, we were almost at 1,000. It's like 980. And in YouTube, it's right at 1,000. It's a few under. So we're getting very, very close to YouTube. So you might say, well, what's different? You showed me all these other DX or these other ham radio podcasts and YouTube channels. What's different? I think what's different is, first of all, it's the only one dedicated only to DX. There's a lot that cover DX topics, but I don't think any of them are specifically dedicated to just DX. So if that's what you're really interested in, it's a good place to find it. The other one, there's a couple of comments here that we've gotten back from listeners and from people that have been on who have literally contacted us and say, hey, I've got questions. And I always ask them, well, why do you like it? What do you find appealing? It's very comfortable. It's like having a cup of coffee with friends and discussing DX. I think that's quite a compliment. Bill's like one of us, and Joe knows all without being a know-it-all. Joe is an extremely humble, extremely unassuming guy, and he's perfect in this role. And yet he knows so much. The guests are passionate and want to share their data. So that's something else we hear all the time. So I would ask you to check us out if you're interested in podcasts and YouTube, and I'm always looking for feedback. What can make it better? What don't you like? Because that's important too. So thank you for your time tonight, guys. I really appreciate it.
I do have a question, Bill. What do you think is the ideal length of a podcast?
Um, I actually think it's about between 45 minutes and an hour. Now, there's a couple I have. So there is unfortunately, he passed at the end of last year. Ralph Fedor, K0. I'm so embarrassed. K0 Ralph is, anyway, that's very embarrassing. But anyway, Ralph is one of those guys where we would start talking and he would get so deep into a subject and yet giving you all this really great information. All of a sudden, it was 2 hours and I had to break that into half. So I'm kind of thinking between 45 minutes and an hour. But for me, if it's a couple hours, if you listen to the Ham Radio Workbench, they always kid about, this one's so loud so long you could cut your grass twice. So depending on how you use it, but I think 45 minutes to an hour.
That's good. Yeah, I agree. Some of the podcasts I'm listening to and contribute, they go an hour and 15 minutes, an hour and a half, too long. You lose the audience after that.
At the same time, though, I finished one just last night with VA3MW Mike Walker from Flex Radio, and I was focusing more on him and less on Flex Radio. And he had so many interesting stories about working at NORAD and working some of the different jobs he had. It's like I just couldn't cut him off, and that ended up being almost 2 hours. But I didn't want to stop it because it was really good, and it's not something I can really edit because I'm going to lose something on both ends. So it's just going to have to be longer. But if we can control it, it's typically 45 minutes.
Okay, great.
Other questions for Bill? Either put them in the chat, raise your hand, or just unmute. And I see
Gene has
Gene
his
has a
hand up.
question.
Let's talk about going to Fredonia.
I'm sorry?
Gene has his hand up. I think he wants to talk about doing a DX expedition to Fredonia.
Go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, guys, good evening. This is Gene MPXUS from Killeen, Texas. It was a great briefing, but when he started talking about Fredonia, I was laughing hysterically at the concept and the reactions of people. And let me tell you, I am going to use the country of Fredonia with a lot of my friends who are non-ham radio operators, talking about my plans on taking a trip this year to Europe to visit Fredonia, to learn the language, the culture, all this kind of stuff, and then not see them for a couple of weeks and come back and give them a briefing on how much fun I had in Fredonia. Oh, this was hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. Thank you so, so much. Not just Fredonia, but for the presentation in general.
Sure. If you Google Fredonia, however, there is actually a Wikipedia entry that will tell you all about it.
Oh,
Rufus
I'm there. I'm gonna
Rufus
do
T.
it.
I think Rufus T. Firefly was Groucho. He was the emperor or something, and it was very good, very funny movie.
I think I remember seeing that episode or that movie many, many years ago, and I gotta like look it up, see if I can find it on YouTube somewhere.
That's good. I hope you get good use out of it.
All right, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Other questions for Bill? Well, Bill, I wanted to mention something while we're waiting to see if there's any other questions. I wanted to let people know about the wonderful job you do each week with the Ohio section newsletter and the postscripts that come out in the in-between weeks of each month. Bill does an article in there on DX every month, every week actually. What number are you up to now on the sessions?
It might be 340, something like that. So
And
it's pretty much
they
been almost 7 years, I guess.
and the good news is you don't need to be a member of the Ohio section or even an ARRL member to receive the newsletter. I'll go ahead and put in the chat the link to the Ohio section newsletter, and you're welcome to sign up and receive that each week. And that's always my favorite part of each week's newsletter is reading Bill's articles. So
Thank you.
they're great.
I appreciate that. So I guess I'll be back in a couple weeks, right?
Yes. I don't remember the exact date. I'll bring that up here in a second. Let me go ahead and tell people what's coming up. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here if I can grab the right button.
Yeah, and I shut my screen share off, so.
Yeah, I just covered it up with another screen. That's the problem. I moved it from one side to the other and covered it up. There we go. So coming up on YouTube, on RATPAC, next week, we have the IEEE Move Disaster Response Truck and coaxial cables and connectors, the inside look. But Bill will be back with us on March 19th, chasing DX during a contest. And it's one of the things I explain to a lot of people. They say, I'm not interested in contesting. I don't like to compete. But I say to them, are you interested in working DX? And if you are, that's when you need to be on. So I'm
You are
looking
right.
forward to that.
Yep, and we go in a little depth about how to use your logging tools to help you ferret out the countries that you need. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I am also. Any other questions for Bill this evening?
We're good in chat.
Also, while we're waiting to see if you have any questions, don't forget to visit the RATPAC site, ratpac.us. You can find links to all of the upcoming videos, as you can see on the screen here, and you can go watch about 500 YouTube videos if you're interested in that. Also, if you're just getting started on HF, we have an excellent series on Beginner's Guide to HF. There's 4 videos from last year. You can find those in the list also.
We're also on Groups.io.
Yes. If you go to the RATPAC site, you'll see that from there you can join a number of different. Let me just go to the RATPAC site real quick. you can join a number of social media, including Groups.io, X, Blue Sky, Threads. I forget what all is there. Oh, Mastodon, Facebook. You can also add the RATPAC calendar to your calendar using Google Calendars and other information. So if it's something you're interested in following us on any of these, we'd love to have you do that. So again, you can join one of the three Groups.io, either Groups.io or Newhams or the emergency communications one. And again, those are all listed right here. It's sec-mcom@groups.io. So you're welcome to join any of those. Do we have any other questions?
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead, Gene.
Yeah, I just want, it's more of a comment than a question. That is a very ambitious schedule of RATPAC sessions we have coming up in the next few months. I'm very looking over that list. I'm like, wow, I really got to make sure that I'm either at home or have some type of internet connectivity with my laptop or tablet, so I don't miss this stuff. But I know that if I should, I can go to the groups.io and see it. But there's nothing like actually seeing it live like we're doing right now. So whoever put the schedule together, signed off on it, I take my hat off to all of them and I salute you all. Thank you for everything you do for RATPAC.
Well, you're very welcome, Gene. And it's a whole group. Dan leads the group, but there's a committee that works on it. And I forgot to mention this tonight. I mentioned it last night. Everyone that's attending tonight, if you could suggest to a friend to join us live in the upcoming weeks, we could double the number of attendees. So again, thank you. If there's no other questions, we're going to close up for tonight. We'll see Bill back in a couple weeks here. And again, we'll see you next Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific.